Good afternoon and welcome to episode 6 of our Fires and Grading show. We're super excited for you guys to all join us today. We have a very special guest to join us today as well. And before we get into any of those formal introductions, just maybe a quick check-in. Don, Garth, Matt, how are you guys doing today?
Great. Say, Garth, chime in. You just got off of 2 long webinars today, so let us know how you feeling.
Fantastic. Yeah, I had 2 great sessions today on leading forward with clarity, and just finished a session 5 minutes ago on grading with intention, which was basically everything we've been talking about within this show. So had a fantastic group joining me. So I'm excited to continue the dialogue with Matt Townsley, who we are so excited to have joining us today.
Hey, it's great to see you all, by the way. Thanks for coming out to Cedar Falls. Was it a couple weeks ago? I think we've seen each other either in person or virtually, but all of us together in one space. That was pretty neat. So a good memory for me this summer.
Absolutely. I know that was great for us. I think that was actually the first time that we were all in the physical same place at the exact same time, at least to my memory. I think it was there as well. But so glad to hear you guys are all doing well. I know we're kind of all coming off of a big holiday weekend, at least for all of us around here in the United States. So just kind of coming off, getting back into the groove this week. But we're super excited for this week's episode. And we are really, when we talk about grading reform, and we've all been parts of these conversations before, but I think this particular fire is one that we've all heard. And I know we say that every time, but I really feel like when we think about this one, we've heard it from multiple different contexts as well. And that's really that phrase of, show me the research that this, right? Meaning whatever that grading reform is that we're diving into, show me how the research that this actually works. And, this is a very honest question. Sometimes I think it's utilized or seen as a roadblock, right? Or maybe as a deterrent potentially to some of the work that we're doing. But really important in terms of how do we respond to that? How do we have a thoughtful response? How do we confidently also respond to that without just saying, well, yeah, there is, but what are we going to back that up with? And so to do that today for our 6th episode, I'm super excited to be joined by 3 amazing individuals who are going to bring some incredible insight to this particular fire. First, I know we've had a little conversation here, but I'd love to welcome Dr. Matt Townsley to our show today. Absolutely huge leading voice in grading reform and the research that goes along with it. I know that one of the things when I'm working with schools and out working, kind of am faced with that question, one of the first places I lead to is the amount of the content that Matt has on his website around all of this different research. So he's, in this field, works in the university setting, but has the, education experience in the classroom, obviously at the administrative level also, but he's also one of our co-authors in Extinguishing the Fires of Assessment and Grading Reform. So he really helps us to bridge that practice to that research in real ways. So Matt, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm super excited for our group to be able to learn from you today, but also our audience to be able to hear from you. And then we also have our 2 very familiar voices, Garth and Don, also with us today. My other 2 co-hosts who have both been in the trenches with all of this work when hearing this fire. So first of all, thank you to all of you for being here today. But let's jump in right away because we know we try to keep this to about an hour for you guys as well. But, I feel like there's a lot to unpack per se around this particular fire. So Matt, I'm going to start with you since you are a special guest. We're going to put you on the spot right away. So when people say, show me the research, because that's real common, what we hear. What do you think it is that they're really asking for? Or maybe what's kind of behind that question when we're met with that question?
Yeah, great question there, Becky. And as I recall back, the first time I was ever asked this question was when our school board actually asked it in my former school district in Iowa. And they weren't asking at all to be antagonistic. It was just hey, if we're going to spend all the time and resources to move forward with this, are we doing what's good for kids? And so at the university where I teach, I love teaching change leadership classes. And one of our big things is assume positive intent. And so I think that's good for us as educators, as school leaders to, when we're first asked that question, to assume positive intent and to share the resources that we have. And I'll admit, as a district level leader, I didn't have those resources, back in 2011, 12, 13, 14, 15, there weren't as many of them available. And so I find myself kind of scratching my head I think there's some good research out there. But let's be honest, that's not a good space to be at, itching our head, scratching our head when these types of big picture questions are asked. And so I think first assuming positive intent, and then share the resources and ask those that are around us to reflect with us. And I think we'll be able to quickly find out if they're genuinely looking to understand the research, or if there is some type of ulterior motive. We'll hear the yeah buts, if you will, that go along with that. In our book, Fire 15 is all about show me some research that says this actually works. We talk about the yeah buts in there. So I think really assuming positive intent is really imperative in answering this question, but also then trying to feel out as a result of where that person's coming from along the way.
Absolutely. And I really love how you said that too. I think it's just a good reminder, because we know when we talk about any grading reform change, we know that we are going to, in some aspect, be met with some forms of resistance. Like it would be odd if we didn't, right? So I think I love that just as that reminder, I think for all of us to file in the back of our minds is that, assuming that positive intent. So I really love that perspective. Kind of thinking, Don and Garth, in your experience, so like you guys have worked with a number of schools, obviously, around this as well, that have been in various stages of grading reform. Can either of you think back to like a moment where this particular fire showed up within a real conversation, and like how did that play out, or kind of who did that stem from? Was it from parents, or was it from educators, or was it from administrators? Like, kind of, do either of you have like a specific story that you can recall of being faced with this fire?
I can chime in on this one, Don, if you want. Yes. Several scenarios of it. And there was one in particular, working with the school district, and it came from a high school teacher. And similar to Matt, where he mentioned with the school board asked it because they said, if we're going to invest our time, energy, and resources into this, we want to know, does it work? And again, I don't think this particular teacher also was being antagonistic with it. It was, they wanted to know, if I go through all of this work that you're asking us to go through, is it going to actually make a difference in my classroom? And I think that's where there's kind of two different pieces of research that we're talking about. There's the outcomes-based research, but there's also the changes in practice, almost the anecdotal research that's really important that we have to take into consideration as well. And so I've heard that. Now, I've also heard a few teachers that are doing it more from a lens of they see it as an opportunity to resist. But I would say more often than not, and in particular that teacher, when I said, kind of pointed to some of the research and the evidence, and the one thing that I know Matt's going to get into this as we go, and our good friend Tom Gusky references this, is the research also, there's a lot of factors that apply to say specifically because of this, is it going to yield the outcome? So I think that's a big part of the dialogue that we all have to be prepared for, which is that's not really the goal. The goal is to achieve, consistency and clarity in what we're doing. But I totally respected that teacher's question because they said, we want to, I'm willing to do the work, but I also want to know that the end result isn't going to be, because let's be honest, in education, we've been burned a few times, right? We've gone through and we've put time, energy, and our own commitments into it as educators just to see it pass, or to find out down the road that, well, really there wasn't enough mounting evidence to say this was worth making the change. So I think those are all things that I really love what Matt just said there, is let's approach that question with the best of intentions and be able to be prepared to discuss it. Don, have you had any similar type experiences?
Yeah, and I think one of the things I just wanted to add in, I think, Matt, when you kind of share some stuff in a minute, maybe share like what's the difference between research and opinions and personal experience, because I think that's an important one. I know it's something we talk a lot about when we get sometimes dig into Hattie's research of like, what is a true meta-analysis and what does that all involve versus just someone's personal opinion? Because I just remember, as Garth said, some meetings where people are like, well, I called the local university and here's what they said. So I did my research. So I'm just curious, when we're talking about what do we mean by actual research as well, and we talk about that, I just want to make sure we're clear on that definition, because people conduct their own, but when we're saying research and education, what are we referring to? So that's a quick one. But then just also, I'd like to say, I think sometimes we set ourselves up for a snarky response, because in reality, we're using the word research all the time in education, and we're referencing effect size, and we're referencing a lot of things, but for some reason, we don't reference the effect size of standards-based grading. So I think sometimes we set ourselves up for that, and it's a good, honest question of what is the effect size of that, and like why isn't there one? So I think that's one of those things for us to touch on a little bit in this episode of where is the current state of it, Matt. When we kind of jump in, that's why we love having you here to help us through that. But that's kind of also been kind of my experience because we use research everywhere else, but suddenly we don't always just bring it up. So why is that?
Yeah, good question. Just one quick clarifier there, Don. Just a great question. When I think about research, when I was a practitioner, I tend to think about the research as, something that somebody else published in a book or an article, right? That was kind of my way of thinking about it. And yet now kind of in our current world, right, where like everything's accessible, well, not everything, but most things are accessible, the opinions can get quickly posted online. And I know of one school district where a parent went out and kind of did their own research and had their packet ready to go and was passing it out. But it was really just, a bunch of comments and opinions. It wasn't really anything that was research. And so I think when I refer to research, I think about those things that are more of the academic, the collecting the data and analyzing the data. That's what I'd call like the peer-reviewed empirical research. And there's going to be another layer after that where we're kind of translating that research into more educator speak. We could talk more about that later too, because I think that's a barrier, right? Is that, we've all read those articles and some of them were like, what in the world were they talking about in there? So it'd be not appropriate to just start handing out, all of that research to our parents who may not even have an idea what they're saying. So again, we can talk more about that. Great point, Don, about what are we talking about when we talk about the research in general.
Yeah, and I love that and appreciate you bringing that up, Don, because I do think, that is sometimes that barrier. And that we think somebody is maybe presenting as the example you gave, Matt, somebody coming with their packet full of information to be able to share, but it's not maybe grounded in anything that we can actually utilize to help us be able to continue to move forward, right? And whatever that reform or changes that we're doing. And I think sometimes that does, like when we just say the word research, I like that we have to also say, but what do we mean by research? I do think that's incredibly important that you guys, Don and Matt kind of both alluded to there. And hopefully that makes, because sometimes I think that research feels intimidating and, we want it to be accessible, but we also have to maybe break down some of those barriers before we can even get to that point. And so I want to make sure that we have some time too. So I know there's a lot kind of just unpacked right there and some things I'm hoping we can circle back to. But one of the things that I really want to make sure that we have some time for discussion today is like, but what does the research actually say? Because I know that, as we said, all of us have experienced this. Matt, you said your first experience that was from a school board. Garth and Don, you kind of alluded to from like teachers or administrators in the examples that you shared. But I think we also, to equip ourselves, any of our listeners, that are joining in or listening, of like, but what are some things that we can point to in terms of what does the research actually say? Because I think it's important for us to be able to make sure that we're well versed in what the research says, so we know where to direct people and not just say, well, go find it, or because then we run into those problems of, well, we're finding opinions versus finding actual research that is backed by data. And so when you start thinking about, and I know this is probably a really big question, so maybe, Matt, Don, and Garth, and you guys jump in, maybe want to narrow the focus in whatever way you find most beneficial. But what does like our literature and our research really say about grading practices that work, especially from the lens of, standards-based or evidence-based or competency-based kind of is the lens that we're kind of, leaning into when we address this fire of what does the research actually say? So I don't know if maybe there's one or two things, Matt, that you want to kind of jump into or that you have noticed over time in your collection and the research that you've done around this work.
I'd say there's three things. First is maybe, Sue Brookhart called this, and I think it was 1991, hodgepodge grading. This idea of grades just being a combination or representation of everything. To quote another scholar, it's almost like everything in the kitchen sink counts for something, the points regardless of their purpose. And so that's been something that has been really traced back for a lot of years. And so I think this idea of a hodgepodge or omnibus grading is one representation of the problems, if you will, of what I'll call traditional or legacy grading practices. Another one is maybe teacher inconsistency in the factors that they utilize. Jim McMillan in the kind of the early 2000s was one. He did some surveys on secondary teachers' grading practices, elementary teachers' grading practices, and just really found a lot of inconsistencies of how teachers approach grading. Just kind of a different spin on the problem, if you will. So hodgepodge or omnibus. So what do grades represent being the first problem. The second problem being more along the lines of consistency. More recently, though, and I think this is where a lot of us are even more interested in is the solutions. Like what? So what? Right? I think that's more of the more recent literature. It's the so what? How should we go about with our grading practices as a result of these problems? And that's where schools, to your point, Becky, are saying, well, how do we separate academics from non-academics? And so they'll label those frameworks as things like standards-based grading or standards reference grading or competency-based education. And that's where you see a lot of the more recent books in peer-reviewed literature. I mean, right? Shout out to Repair Kit for Grading. Ken O'Connor as just being a fantastic example of trying to translate that research into something that classroom educators can consume. There's a whole laundry list of, Garth was talking about the outcomes versus like how to do it, the implementation. I've just got a whole list of things I could list, from the early mid 2000s to today of, how our PE teachers finding success and challenges in implementing standards-based grading, how are administrators approaching it and so forth. And I think that's really more kind of the evolving nature of grading practices right now is how do we go about doing that? Lots of good resources out there. It's a matter of finding the ones that kind of align with where the school or school district is at in their process. And I think that's what's exciting right now about being involved in that space is exploring the common problems and challenges that are out there and trying to provide solutions. And then, of course, again, translating them into accessible things. We've got Google Scholar out there, right, which is awesome. The ERIC database, which is kind of like a government repository of educational research, be another example of where educators can find this stuff. I'm sure Garth and Don have you could shout out names and resources as well. I'll just turn it over to you. Like what do you see as being out there in the research that educators are looking for in their questions in classrooms and schools out there?
As I say, it always brings me back to the one of the expressions that we try to folks with getting back to if your goal is standards-based grading, you're potentially going to struggle, right? We always say our goal is clarity and consistency, which will lead to positive things. And I know we reference the research around clarity a lot. And obviously that's why, as Garth referenced briefly at the beginning, you're just running a couple of workshops on it, but it's such an important factor, I think. But still, in the end, I think people want an overarching kind of summary. I think that's the thing. I know right now that's one of the issues we have, right? Of we're still in this phase of we're learning a lot and implementation varies widely. So I think, I don't know if after Garth, if you share, Matt, if you just want to touch on that of I do feel like people are looking for this overarching big, here's what the current research says is effective or not. You know what I mean? I think that's the touch on that is where are we in that journey? But Garth, what do you have to add as well?
Well, I think just to add to it, I know even just when I just got done with this workshop I just did, one of the introductory things I did with the school leaders around this was just showing them, kind of a deeper look into some of the factors within the visible learning database. So Don mentioned teacher clarity. Well, we can specifically point that currently based on the information in the database that yields an effect size of 0.85, so almost 2 times the rate of learning by just having clarity. Now, clarity alone isn't standards-based grading, but having clarity is a part of it. Or teacher estimates of achievement, knowing that teacher estimates of achievement yields an effect size of well above 1, right? So again, which means that the teacher has a pulse on where each student is in the room and can identify the next steps. Well, if you have really good identification of standards or targets and assessments that are adequately and authentically measuring that, well, then you can get that element of teacher estimates of achievement in place. So again, a component. So I think to that point is there's so many factors, and I'm sure, Matt, this is what you're going to touch on with this. There's so many factors when we say standards-based grading that we can introduce elements of it and be able to support, here's what the current research is supporting around that. But as a package, and actually being able to point to an end result is very difficult because there's too many variables that are associated with it. Is that a fair way of kind of putting that, Matt?
Yeah, you bet. I think, and to add on to that, Garth, one of the most prominent studies that's been out there was conducted or published, I should say, in 2016. Sue Brookhart, Tom Guskey, and a whole host of others published in a very prominent research journal called the Review of Educational Research. And the article is called "A Century of Grading Research." What they did is they just compiled a whole list of all of the research that had been conducted up into that point and just said, so what do we know about it? You can also find their book called "What We Know About Grading: What Works, What Doesn't, and What's Next." It really just synthesizes a lot of like what was known up into that point. And basically what it says, Garth, is it just echoes what you said, right? Like there is this lack of clarity in legacy grading practices. There's this lack of consistency in legacy grading practices. And so that's why Don's like, it's not really about standards-based grading. It's about getting clarity and consistency in our grading practices along the way. One of the things we could talk about, and sometimes research will get picked apart, and I'd say like rightly so, because there hasn't been a research study conducted in every single setting for every single scenario. And that's just the nature of educational research, right? Like somebody's going to read a study that was conducted in New York City, and they're going to say, well, we're not in New York City. We're not in an urban setting. So what is it? What about me, right? But that's just the nature of it. And so I wish that those of us that are have one foot in the educational research world could just snap our fingers and make all that happen. But it's just not feasible. And so yes, it's important for us to understand what the research says. And maybe, Garth, to simplify maybe why we want this is sometimes when we think about research, we think about like that 7th grade science experiment. If I just mix these two chemicals together, it will always give me this solution, right? It's not that simplistic in educational research. There's just a lot more factors than mixing some chemicals together. And I've had a conversation with others who try to pick up on the research. And when I explain this to them, they're like, oh, that's why this very specific question I'm trying to answer is not yet answerable through research, because it's just not there. And that's where we have to, piece together other research. And that's honestly what researchers also do, is they try to say, well, I know this. If I put them together, here's what I think is the best practice today based upon what I know. And maybe somebody's going to come along, 15 years from now and prove me wrong, but that's just the best we know today.
I think one thing, just a huge thing that stuck out to me right now, and just thinking of how do we help others kind of guide, if they're in these situations and they hear this, what about the research? And the one big takeaway that I just had from all three of you, kind of, if I had to summarize a piece of that, was that if you're looking for research just on, for example, the results or outcomes of standards-based grading, you may not find a lot of research that is specific to that. However, could you refocus that conversation and start looking at the parts and pieces? So whether it's the separation of the academics from the behaviors, and what does the research say about that? Or talking about clarity, as you mentioned, Garth, and what does the research say about when we have those, that level, those levels of ultimate clarity, or reassessment, right? All of these pieces and parts that make are an integral portion of standards-based grading or evidence-based grading, competency-based grading, but we don't necessarily have a lot of research yet, because it would be very difficult to be able to provide research on the implementation of standards-based grading, because how schools implement it are very different from one another. So would that be like a good summary, would you guys say, kind of what you said, just as a talking point, I think, for others who are, faced with that exact question?
Yeah, I agree. I think that's how you phrase that, Becky, is a great question. I think it's then always going back and digging into what's the question they're asking, getting back to the root of what's the frustration or the confusion, and what are we trying to answer, and how can we help support them, because they're struggling with something right now, they're wrestling with something. So how can we get back to that? And then we say to them, well, let's get to that specific question. If we want, let's do some research around that. Let's see what is working with schools. What are the practices? What can we learn from that? And I always say to folks, one big thing to remember is some of those effect sizes. Remember, it tells you, if you look at a lot of the research, it tells you the effect size of how things are currently being implemented. It doesn't tell you what it could be. Okay, that's one of the big, and I think there's a lot of really great things when you look at the list of effect sizes that have some really low effect sizes that It just tells you how it's being implemented. And it's and I always think one of the big ones is time. It has a very low effect size. It's 0.1 something. And because sometimes people think if we just change our time, it's going to improve instruction. Well, it's how we use the time is what actually matters the most. So I think that's a big one as we think through that of let's take a look at those. And even if something has a low effect size too, I always say let's reflect on why that's low and how do we not repeat whatever they were doing, if you will, whoever they are, to have that low effect size. So I think everything is this moment to always going to go, let's learn more about that, because there's an opportunity here for us to be different and be better and continue to learn from the research about what mistakes folks had made or were making along the way. So as one quick comment, just want to add there.
I think there's so much here, and I feel like I could go in so many different directions with our conversation. But one thing I kind of want to bring it back to, actually like your experiences. So Don and Garth, I'm going to lean to you here. Matt, feel free to jump in or chive in or jump in when you can. But when you think about, okay, well now I've linked, you're working with teachers or, school boards, et cetera, out in the field, and you've started to find some links or resources in terms of the research to be able to share with them. Do you feel like you typically see some of that maybe resistance, whether it's resistance on purpose or just resistance from a lens of like, I really just need to know more. I'm not trying to dig my heels in, but I really just need to know more. Do you feel like you see that kind of soften or kind of get tracked back a little bit once you can connect research to whether it's the actual student outcomes or that specific piece or part of grading reform when you're able to bring that in? Do you see a change?
I think it's probably hit and miss on that one, Becky, because I think Matt brought up a good point. You can provide them with a link, you can give them a study, and if they're really resistant, they're going to find everything wrong with the study, as you said. Well, that was done in New York City, and we're in rural Montana, and those two are not, so I can't possibly use that as a justification. I think others that are looking for the reassurance, they're going to see the value in it. They're going to, and that are truly. So I think it does depend on the approach. But I do want to bring up one more piece that I found I think helps, using your words, Becky, helps soften the resistance a little bit. And I found it's if we can shift a little bit from research to evidence, being able to say Becky, I've been with you in front of groups of teachers where you've talked about the evidence you saw in your classroom. Well, that's not research, but it is something that is directly related to an experience that has happened. And when you talk about the evidence you have of what you saw differently with the kids, that's where I start to see a little bit of kind of people being a little bit less resistant because of the experience you had and how you share that. Now, research can be a collection of evidence over time. So there may be pieces there that we can bring into that where, researchers, as Matt said, is they're pulling from all sorts of different experiences. So I found that it's a contributing factor to help within the research, but also just being able to speak to the evidence of experience and what you noticed, which again is going to be much more narrative and anecdotal, has also led to a little bit more of kind of people being receptive. And Don and Matt, I don't know if you've noticed that as well when you're in front of groups where speaking to the evidence, which is also just as equally, because we could switch that out to say, show me the research or show me evidence that it works. It's going to be the same conversation, but it's just kind of reframing what it looks like.
Adding on that, Garth, I think the hard part is, as I kind of go back, why are they asking the question in the first place? It's because most people have either experienced something negative in their own classroom or they saw it in another school or to their own child, right? So that's where the root of it's coming from. So I kind of sometimes come back to, because they're going to come at you with the same level of evidence, if you will, that we might be bringing to them, and it might be just equally as negative. So that's why they're asking. So I think about, as you're saying, you're giving them then the samples of when it could work, and then there's a middle. Why did that one not work? Why did this one work? So let's figure out what's the difference between the two. And that to me is more of these, we talk about what's the evidence of what are the practices that led to the failure and what are the practices that led to the success? And how can we figure that out? Because I say that when we talk about initial evidence, well, they're coming to us with their whole laundry list of stories and they're not wrong, right? And we say to folks, like, they're never wrong with their experiences and what they've had. So how do we help say what practices led to that poor experience, and what are the practices that led to then, as you say, Becky, having the better experiences and her when she shares that? Because there's definitely a big difference there. So how can we dig into those?
Yeah, and that kind of makes me wonder a question that I had written down a little bit earlier as we were talking too of like, is there a good way to leverage or balance that? Like, like the research and the experience? Because, as we say, like we're starting to see more and more research, obviously over time, but is it okay for us to lean more on evidence if the research maybe isn't there yet? Or, and I don't know, like I don't know, just kind of being vulnerable asking that question too, because I know sometimes like when I'm working with schools and I've had an opportunity to live through all of this grading reform change as a teacher in a high school classroom. And so a lot of times I will share my experience, as you were mentioning, Garth, because I did see it firsthand and I did know the changes that we were going through. And I had a moment to be reflective and saying, but this is what it looked like before the change, whatever that was, reassessment, separation of academics from behaviors, right? Name any of the grading reform changes. And I'm telling you what it looks like from my experience, what I noticed, in my own classroom. Or I have kids who also go to districts, that have gone through these grading reform changes in their elementary, middle school, and high school. So I see it from a parent perspective also. And I think for some people that's enough, but others are like, but yet still show me the research of the outcomes. And I guess I don't know. I don't know if anyone has a point, and maybe it's not an answerable question. It's just kind of a thought that's stirring in my mind of like, what is that balance or that leverage point, and is it okay to just use experience if we don't have research to support it yet, or is that, I don't know, just more of a talking point, I guess.
One thing I think you bring up is a really good point that ties into what both Don and Matt said. Is there might be that might be where the and comes in place, but I see it a little differently as and instead of and show me the research, an opportunity to introduce the research of why schools can't accomplish your experience or why teachers can't get to that experience. Because there's a lot of research on why grading reform fails, right? There's a lot of experience. Some of I've done my own on that too. And so I think that's where it's like, it's a good entry point to be able to share that, but then enter into, in this case, obviously it's counterproductive to tell me the research that shows it works. I'm giving you evidence of what I saw, and here's research that exists out there as to why this often fails. I don't know that. Matt, do you have a different thought on how that could be brought together?
Yep, I think so too. I think sometimes it's a trust or credibility thing versus just the research itself. Right? Like we've all been there where the school administrator pulls us aside afterwards, like you just said basically the same thing that I've been saying or somebody else been saying. But because you came in, they listen to you, which is awesome. But they don't just listen to Becky or Don or Garth or Matt because we're spouting off the research. It's because Becky can share about how she has experienced that. So she has credibility because she can say, I've made these mistakes and I've had these successes, and I can feed into what the research says, or at least broadly speaking, what the research says we ought to be doing for grading practices. And so I think it can serve as an introduction to build credibility at the very least by sharing that evidence that you're talking about, Becky and Garth. And then secondly, I think also it provides an opportunity, a glimpse of an opportunity to say that there are a variety of different ways to do what we know now about effective grading research. As I think about the current grading research out there, think of like a concentric circle. Like on the outer circle, there's a lot of different ways to kind of, do this work. Even if you read this person, this book, this grading expert, and this grading expert, sometimes their ideas are like this, right? And so I see that as being kind of on the outer circle of a concentric circle, but there are some things on the inside of that concentric circle, for example, like separating academics from behaviors, like you're talking about, Becky, that everybody agrees upon. And so I think if we can be honest about that, and when someone says, oh, that's not been my experience, say, well, hey, here's the big picture of where we know we need to go. How can your experience, maybe it's because what you thought your experience was didn't actually align with what I'm saying, right? We've all been there. And so I think that's maybe where those entry points play themselves out. But I think if we're just honest about, there are multiple pathways to implement these effective grading practices, I think it again builds that credibility where someone can also feel comfortable saying, I tried reassessments and it was a train wreck. Well, let's talk about what that looked like and so forth. I think that provides an opportunity for us to enter into that conversation even more.
So one thing I feel like I just had an aha moment. And maybe it's just about that. Like as you guys were kind of talking through that about leveraging and balancing experience and research and like how do we use those together? I'm wondering if it's more that like the research is really utilized to understand the effectiveness of the practice itself. Whereas the experience piece comes in of how did it come to life and what did you see as a result, like a firsthand experience of the result. And I don't know if anyone, that's where my brain kind of just went as we kind of started piecing that through, like how do you use those two things potentially together. One of the things I kind of think about too of like is, do you guys, have you, and anyone feel free to kind of chime in here, but have you guys found a way or like a strategy to maybe best help present the research? Because obviously, I think someone mentioned it before. I don't remember who, like when you give some people research, they're like, yeah, I don't want to read that. Right. Or I don't want to look at that. But others are really, really wanting that as well. Have any of you found any strategies that maybe best help to present or share that research with those that need it or maybe don't want it and still need it?
So I initially half jokingly say I direct them to Matt's website is a strategy that I do. So Matt, just briefly, just take a second, share your website so everyone knows what we're referring to when we say that as well. What is the collection that you have on there?
Yeah, just hop on to hop onto Google, go to all things standards-based grading, and once you're there, there'll be a couple of different quick little places you can go. And there's a comprehensive list of scholarly research. It's updated about every month or so as new articles and so forth are published. That's where I place them, and so it's a quick way to get there. All things standards-based grading on Google. Click through that comprehensive list, Don, and I think that's maybe I don't know. I think it's the most up-to-date resource out there for educators that are doing that. So back over to you, Don.
Yeah. So sorry, I should have mentioned that at the beginning. Sorry about that, Robert. But that is honestly, I say I half jokingly say that, but that's the number one spot. And then from there, let's dig into, to me, when we're presenting, it's getting to the root of what are we struggling with at the moment, Becky, and it's trying to narrow down what are the studies saying about that and what are the effective practices that surround that. Because I think one of the points of pride I always have in Becky, Garth, and I here in our group is that we aren't hung up on one single way. I think we're practitioners more than anything else. And we say, what's the current reality of the school and the district? So what's the current struggle we're having? And what can we learn from everyone else who's done this prior to us about how they've implemented it or not? Because we say we're on the right path, but how we get there could be slightly different. So I personally, I look for what are we actually struggling with and what's the research around that practice right now? Because say most people don't come, as you said, Matt, angry and not wanting to do it. They're struggling with how do I do it well? I don't want to look silly in front of my kids, in front of my parents, that kind of stuff. Garth, what are you thinking?
No, it's a great point. Always reference Matt's website, but I think that's a really good way of approaching that conversation is let's not take a look at, try to find the research from the 30,000 foot view. Let's pinpoint what their goals are, what they're working on, where is that struggle. And now let's start to identify some studies out there, because again, there's really good elements of what could be found within a school's definition of the practices they're implementing within a standards-based approach. So let's find where the problem is and let's look for research that supports that dialogue.
And would that be the recommendation that you would give? I'm thinking of like, the lens of a school leader who's like, okay, I want to start this conversation. I want to, what is my best approach to this if I want to pull in the research and start a conversation, with educators in my building? Is that kind of what you guys would all recommend? I know, Garth, that kind of is what you had said there too, of like kind of more of a small scale focal point, like what problem are we trying to fix, right? Or make better, or depending maybe really upon the goals, if it's the big picture study or kind of narrowing in on the small scale. I don't know if Don or Matt, you have anything else to add to that kind of from a leadership standpoint of trying to lead this work, for some of our administrators in their districts and their schools.
Yeah, I'd give a shout out to page 101 in our Extinguishing the Fires book. There's a bit of kind of like a bulleted list format. If I'm a school leader, I'm probably going to create, maybe go on Matt Townsley's website or wherever and start to look at some of that research. Hey, if we're thinking about changing our homework practices, what does the research say about some homework stuff? And just put some excerpts in there in a bulleted list form. If we're thinking about doing something different with reassessment, what's the research say about that? Put some of those bulleted lists in there. I'd like to think that every educator has the time to read, the 25-page journal article that Matt Townsley published last week, but I know they don't. And so why not give it to them in an accessible format that they can consume? Put the references on there if you want to, and allow those that want to dig deeper to do that. But I think just creating some bulleted list summaries, I know that some school districts out there in the world are doing this. They're going to posting them online for parents or stakeholders that want to dig in themselves. And so, as you do that, look for articles that are publicly available when possible, or that are otherwise linked online, so that the people that want to read it can find it without having to pay $39.95 to download the article.
And I would say I just recently stumbled into that whole journey. I saw the outcomes-based education on the list had visible learning met X has an effect size of 0.97. So I'm like, what's that connection? And luckily that paper though was available, but I wasn't ready to read the long research paper yet. I'm like, I'm going to dig into this one, you guys. So if you haven't checked that out, I see it has an effect size of 0.97. It lists a bunch of studies that were done. But definitely, the initial top of that talked about how it is having clear outcomes for students and how they end up finishing. I know there's going to be some connections there to some of this work, but as have one of those moments of, I love the research, I want to dig in, but I did not have the moment at that moment to jump in. That's what I'm going to do for sure. And Matt, just, someone had posted, I think on one of our channels, they attempted to access your website, but didn't allow it because it was not a secure website, they said. So I'm not sure. I'm not a tech support person, but I know that your website's out there, so maybe try a different browser or something. But
a quick hack for that school leader as well. This book, the most called "Using Grading to Support Student Learning." It's concise. It's about 100 pages. There's over 200 references here. No, let's be honest with each other. If you want a book to put yourself asleep, this is it. It's not exciting. It's not engaging, but there's a chapter on the intersection between grading and homework, grading and formative assessment, grading and summative assessment. So at the very least, if I'm a school leader, I could go right here and just, all the citations. Here we go. Have at it as a starting point to create a resource such as the one we mentioned, that bulleted list, if you will.
Would you guys, and thank you, because I know that's really founded in some great research also to back up all of that in that publication that you have there, Matt. One of the things, would there be a different recommendation for approach if the approach was for, we just kind of talked about leaders leading their buildings or their schools? Would there be a different recommendation at all? Or you guys think the same recommendation if it was to support, if the approach was to share research with the school board or with families, kind of thinking the same approach? Or have you guys found any different strategies that were maybe helpful to share research in that respect?
Matt, I'm going to lean on you. You have the book on engaging families in grading reform. So
our book, A Parent's Guide to Grading and Reporting, I think what we tried to do, that was another challenging book to write, and that we tried to write that book. Myself and Chad Lang wrote that book to try to help parents understand all of this. And so if you've ever read the USA Today newspaper, what you may or may not know is that the USA Today is intended to be written in more of a 6th, 7th, and 8th grade reading level, if you will. And so that's how we tried to write this book, not edges speak, but more parent speak. And so, of course, I think it's a fantastic book. But I think to your point, or to your question, Becky, if I were to create the equivalent of a bulleted list, as I was alluding to earlier, I would try to take out a lot of that edges speak. Don and I love to talk about meta-analyses. We could talk about p-values. We could talk about peer debriefing and sample size and all that fun stuff. But if I'm a parent, now, again, you have to know your community, right? There could be some communities where you have to include that language, but generally speaking, try to just say, hey, here is what the research says about homework. And I don't know, in the world we live in, ChatGPT, AI may be able to help us. I bet there's a prompt if we put something in there that we would have written in our EduSpeak and we ask it to maybe bring it down to more of a 8th grade reading level. I bet generative AI could help us out with that.
And I think that's a great point too. And I know it will do that actually, because I know we do that a lot too. Like, okay, how do I put that into student friendly language or parent friendly language, even from the lens of a learning target, or how we're communicating what success looks like to students. So love that representation as well, kind of as another hack for us to be able to utilize in that. We're getting kind of close to our end here, and I want to address one more kind of concept here. And this is really from the lens of like, is there one like grading related research myth that you wish we could just like address right now and be like, we need to stop this? And I don't know if Matt, I'm going to lean to you to kind of kick off this part of this conversation too. Is there one that really sticks out to you of like, we just wish this would go away? It's a myth kind of around any grading related research.
Yeah, maybe it's a hot take that's not mine, but it's one that I want to lean into. In 2022, Garth was alluding to this earlier, I believe. In 2022, Tom Guskey and Laura Link wrote a paper called "Is Standards-Based Grading Effective?" And in there, you'd think that grading advocates would be all about trying to put the positive spin on grading reform, and they certainly do about what standards-based grading is and the potential that it has. But in that, and I've shared this even like in some of our staggered conference presentations, it's like, if we just do standards-based grading, you can't expect your ACT, SAT, or state standardized test scores to magically go up next year or the year after. Because if we think about it from what standards-based grading, for example, really is it's just changing the language at the very like high level of what our grade books represent. Now, in there, just to be clear, for anyone watching this, like, what are you talking about, Townsend? Like, can you believe he even said that on this Fires Grading podcast? What Tom Guskey and Laura Link do also share is what standards-based grading can and could be, is the basis for some absolutely fantastic improvements that take place in schools. It will allow us to get better information about where our students are at so we can do something better with that before. It will allow us to have more clarity around students we're at. So use your phrase, Don. It'll allow us to be more consistent in how we approach grading practices. And so we can do better things for kids as a result of that. And so I'll be honest, I've written an article that tries to kind of like pitch standards-based grading as being, if we do it, it's going to be fantastic for student achievement. But I kind of, in my own thinking at that time, I had my 7th grade science experiment. If you just do this, then you can expect this to happen. There's just so many complexities, so many nuances. And so I just love to point that out. It's not a reason we shouldn't do it. Oh, hey, don't hear anybody here on the podcast saying that. But what it does tell us is we have to use that information better to get the results that we probably already want. And that's for student learning to improve.
I was going to add on and a recent story of when I was with a group of teachers, and I'll never forget when one of them, a district that had been progressing and moving, and the one teacher said, we switched to this system, but that's all that's changed for me is the symbol that goes on at the very end. My classroom hasn't changed. Can't we just go back to an A, B, C, D, and F? Because I don't understand why we even changed in the first place. And I would say for that teacher in that moment, they're not wrong. There's a lot of other things we want that need to occur in the meantime. But for that teacher, throughout all the implementation, the only thing that changed for that teacher was the symbol at the end, and the classroom wasn't. So if that's all they do, Matt, I think you're right. Then they're not wrong. Then nothing's changed. So,
but I'll just add one more thing, and then I know Don's going to add some things. Like there's some research, for example, from Megan Knight and Robin Cooper, where as teachers did these standards-based grading practices, they started to share, what? I get students all of a sudden had more voice in their learning. Oh my goodness, I had a much clearer understanding of what I was supposed to be teaching and assessing. I provided better feedback. And so that's from the voices of teachers who have implemented this. Who doesn't want that, right?
I think that's and kind of goes, ties us back to that experience, right? To be able to share that also. And when we have actual evidence that supports that, but then also goes along with the research that we're pulling in to utilize, I think together as a package, that can be incredibly powerful. Sometimes maybe it's not the research alone or not the experience alone, but when we can really meld those two things together, right? When we have the right people to be able to do that, I think that's really where we start. I know at least in my experience, experience. So that's where we really start to see people go, like, just as you guys said, yeah, I want that for my kids too. Like, I want to see that in my classroom, right? How do all these things tie together? So I know we're coming up kind of on our end of our time here today. And I feel like if I ask one more question, that it's going to probably take us in a whole different direction. So I'm going to pause us here, but I know this has been an incredibly rich conversation. So huge thank you, Matt, for joining us today and being here. Obviously, Dawn and Garth as well, and kind of jumping into this conversation. We could probably have an entire second episode where we dig a little bit even deeper and further into kind of.
Matt, will you come back another one? Will you come back down the road, Matt?
Let's do it. Let's do it.
So watch for that. Yeah, watch for that.
Yeah, because the one I want from Matt, as someone who works at the university level right now, it's not a myth in research, Becky, but my response, if I'd answered that question, was colleges aren't doing this. And so I know, Matt, as someone who's in a college, that's a topic we need to hit soon. That's a topic I think we hear a lot of what's going on at the university level. I know, Matt, you'd be a great voice to add into that, as well as I know our folks from the Grading Pod who themselves are university folks doing it at the university level, the whole podcast just for university folks. So it's like, no one can tell me that's not happening when there's a podcast dedicated just to that. So just want to point that out. I know for sure, Matt, I want you to come back for that topic if you're willing to.
Let's do it.
Yeah. Well, I guess you have 2 future podcasts to join us for, so we can continue the research conversation. And then also, yes, the second, post-secondary lens, Matt is our person, one of our people here that will definitely give us some great insight to that. I know we shared before that. So Matt shared how to kind of connect with him via his website. He'll look into the security issue or whatever it was that was kind of popping up there. But once you get to that site, I know that I guide so many people that direction. Don and Garth, I know you both do as well. I go there myself because I know it's a one-stop shop to be able to find research from all different areas of grading reform and accountability for students and improving student learning and outcomes. So thank you for all of your work and Matt is amazing at keeping that up to date. Right. So that's one other thing. He has things organized by years of like 2025 versus 2024. So love that, and definitely dive in when you guys have an opportunity to do that. We always like to say also to anyone listening, if our conversations today helped you, please take a moment, share, join our listserv so we can let you know when our next episodes are. We sincerely appreciate you joining us today. And I'm going to turn it over to Don so he can share with you about our next episode 7. Don, you want to give him a little bit of insight as to what's coming next month?
Yeah, so episode 7 is coming up in a hurry. I feel like they always come up in a hurry. It'll be on August 4th at 4 p.m. Central Time. I think, am I correct with that, Garth and Becky? I assume I am. But our topic there is we're finally let's come back to the original one of, we hear all the time, the fire up, this won't prepare our students for the real world. And I think it's just a fun one to just sit and chew on for a solid hour. So we're pretty excited to talk about this won't prepare our students for the real world. I know, Matt, I saw your face light up just when we said that's one we hear quite a bit. So Matt, feel free, if you want to join in, you could jump in and say, hey, I've got something to say. You could always hop on the middle of that one if you want and join us. Feel free. But this won't prepare students for the real world. August 4th at 4 p.m. Central Time.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us today or for listening when you have an opportunity. We look forward to seeing you at our next episode in August.